He was not there, no human was, yet their shadow controlled the moment the entire galaxy changed. For centuries, aliens laughed at the idea of humans being dangerous. In every academy, young cadets joked about the tiny human ships that once flew in space. Teachers used humans as comedy examples, showing images of their old metal crafts and calling them weak, soft, and harmless. They said humans were emotional, chaotic, silly creatures who built toys, not weapons. No one feared humanity. No one respected them. Humans had disappeared long ago, leaving behind nothing but broken satellites and forgotten history. Their name became a joke. But everything shifted on a silent morning at the edge of the Zelvar Empire, where patrol cruisers drifted under calm stars. A massive metal shape appeared out of nowhere. It did not warp in. It did not jump. It was simply there, hanging in space like a dead moon. The patrol ship scanners tried to read it, but the numbers froze. The screens flickered. The sensors shut down. No data came through. The alien crew whispered, confused and annoyed, assuming it was a malfunction. They rebooted the systems. Tried again. Nothing. The object had no measurable energy, no life signs, no recognizable material. It was like scanning a shadow. The commander stared through the window, his skin turning pale as he saw the shape up close. It was gigantic, larger than any known warship, darker than deep space, and built with sharp edges that looked like blades stretching across kilometers. But it did not move. It made no sound. It just existed, silent and terrifying. The crew began to laugh nervously, trying to hide their fear. They joked that it looked like a giant broken can, a piece of human trash floating in space. They called it ugly, primitive, stupid human scrap, and said humans must have tried to build something big once and failed, leaving this hunk of metal behind. Their laughter echoed across the bridge, shaky and forced, because deep inside they felt something cold crawling up their spines. The silence of the object was unnatural. Dead. Watching. The commander ordered a full scan using the Empire's oldest database, hoping to match the structure with something from history. The room went quiet as the database churned, old servers vibrating, ancient files opening for the first time in centuries. Then suddenly, every screen in the room flashed red. A loud alarm exploded. A single message appeared in bold, glowing letters. Identified, Terran warship, class unknown. Age, 1,000 years. The words hit the crew like a bolt of lightning. Terran. Human. A warship. 1,000 years old. The commander's hands trembled as he tried to breathe. The youngest officer whispered, his voice cracking, asking how humans could have built something this massive 1,000 years ago, when alien civilizations themselves were barely learning space travel. Shock spread like poison. If this ship was truly human, then everything they believed about humans was wrong. The galaxy didn't laugh anymore. The commander sent urgent messages to the Empire, demanding backup and guidance. Across the stars, leaders awoke, scientists rushed to terminals, and military chiefs stared in disbelief. The Zelvar Empire scrambled entire fleets to the site, surrounding the dark object with hundreds of shining warships. The new ships scanned it too, but their systems failed. Some even burned out, smoke filling the control rooms. Nothing could penetrate its surface. It reflected all signals like a void. As more ships arrived, so did arrogance. Admirals cracked jokes, mocking the ancient Terran design, comparing it to rusted metal and calling it a failed experiment. They believed humans never possessed power, never had genius, never had strength. They said no warship that old could be dangerous. They claimed it must be dead, empty, useless. But beneath their laughter was fear. The warship was bigger than any Empire flagship, darker than any stealth hull, and silent in a way that felt alive. Even without movement, it demanded attention, like a sleeping predator waiting to open its eyes. The scientists scanned the hull material and discovered something terrifying. It was made from an alloy no alien science could identify. It was harder than known metals, older than Empire records, and carried traces of energy that predated most civilizations. The report came back with one line: material, non-replicable. Origin, Terran. Age, 1,000 years. The Empire's leaders went pale. If humans built this ship 1,000 years ago, that meant humans had technology beyond anything the galaxy currently had, even now. The thought sent chills through every scientist and soldier. For the first time, they wondered if humanity had been hiding the truth. What if humans had never been weak? What if they had chosen silence? As the fleets circled the motionless ship, strange signals began pulsing from its hull. Slow thumps like a heartbeat, steady and deep, echoing through space. The sound didn't come through speakers. It hit the bones of every living being nearby. The airtight ships vibrated as if something ancient was waking up. Fear spread from ship to ship like a virus. The youngest officers felt their chests tighten. Some covered their ears, even though the sound wasn't real sound. It was something deeper, older, something that felt like memory. The commander of the first patrol ship stared at the motionless giant and felt the hair on his neck rise. He realized something horrifying. This ship was not broken. It was sleeping. And if it woke up, no one knew what would happen. Messages spread across star systems, causing panic. Civilians demanded answers. Governments denied the news, terrified of revealing the truth. Rumors whispered that humans once fought a war so big it erased entire worlds. Older species shivered, remembering old legends about humans being creators of impossible weapons, builders of machines meant to reshape galaxies. But those were myths, weren't they? The Empire decided to send a drone closer, hoping to force open the mystery. The small machine drifted near the hull, scanning every surface. When it touched the ship, a shockwave burst outward. Every screen in every ship turned black. Engines died. Lights flickered. Space fell silent. Then, a single ancient symbol lit up on the warship's surface, a glowing Terran mark, pulsing like breath. No one understood it, but every soul felt it. It was not a greeting. It was a warning. The warship still did not move, yet its presence crushed the courage of every being around it. The laughter stopped. The jokes died. Even the bravest soldiers felt their hearts shaking. The galaxy suddenly realized the terrifying truth. Humans were not harmless. They were not weak. They were not stupid. They had built something beyond comprehension 1,000 years ago, something no empire could even scan. And if this was only one ship, how many more existed? The commander stared at the sleeping war machine and understood something he wished he never knew. The galaxy had not mocked humans. The galaxy had mocked a storm that might be ready to rise again. And somewhere in the silent dark of that ancient Terran hull, something shifted, like the first breath after 1,000 years, as if the warship was waiting for just one more reason to wake up. The warship did not move, yet its presence felt heavier with every passing second, like a silent weight pressing on every heart watching it. And across the fleet a strange emotional tension grew, something between fear and disbelief, because no one could understand how something so old could feel so alive. And as the Empire's ships floated in formation around the massive Terran giant, the crew members began to whisper to themselves, asking questions they were too terrified to say out loud, wondering what kind of species could build such a thing 1,000 years ago, wondering why humans ever needed a ship this size, wondering what kind of enemy could have pushed humanity to create something that looked less like a vessel and more like a weapon shaped by desperation and fury. And while the admirals tried to maintain control, their eyes revealed the truth. They were scared, deeply scared, because for the first time in their lives they were facing something they could not measure, could not understand, and could not control. And in that silence the emotions in the fleet began to change from arrogance to dread, especially when the first detailed scan report came in, revealing that the ship was not just large, it was layered with multiple hulls, each thicker than an entire battleship, each storing unknown technology, each pulsing with faint echoes like buried memories. And the scientists argued in panic, saying the readings suggested the warship was not powered down but instead was conserving energy, like a creature in deep sleep. And that thought alone spread chills through every soul aboard the fleet, because the idea of a sleeping human weapon was more horrifying than any active threat. And still the ship refused to move, its black metal skin swallowing all light, its shape cold and merciless, its silence screaming louder than any alarm. And while the commanders sent urgent messages begging their empire for guidance, the civilians on nearby planets began to feel the panic too. as public broadcasts leaked fragments of the truth, sparking fear across entire worlds, making parents hold their children tighter. Making old veterans remember ancient rumors about humanity, stories passed down like nightmares about a species that once fought with a fire no one could match. A species that vanished not because they were defeated but because they chose to leave, and those whispers returned now like ghosts, haunting the Empire. Because what if humans had never been weak? What if they had only been waiting? And while the political leaders debated hiding the discovery, the scientists begged them to stay away, warning that the ship was reacting to their presence even though it showed no movement, because their instruments detected faint electromagnetic pulses from deep inside the Terran vessel, pulses that matched biological rhythms, pulses that sounded like a heartbeat, slow and ancient, thumping through the void like the echo of a sleeping giant. And the moment those pulses were confirmed, everything changed emotionally inside the fleet. Suddenly every soldier felt small, every officer felt powerless, every voice trembled as they asked the same terrifying question in their minds. If this ship has a heartbeat, then what exactly is inside it? And as fear tightened like a fist around the Empire's throat, a young communications officer, barely trained, burst into tears because she could feel something she could not explain, like the ship was staring back at her, like it could sense every thought, every fear, every breath. And she whispered to her commander that the warship didn't feel dead, it felt aware, and though he wanted to dismiss her words, he couldn't, because deep inside his own chest he felt it too. A cold awareness like unseen eyes watching, judging, remembering, and then, as if responding to their fear, the warship's hull flickered with a soft glow, only for a second, like a dying star trying to breathe, and that single flicker shattered whatever pride the fleet still held. Because in that moment every being in every ship felt a wave of emotion that didn't come from themselves, a crushing sadness, ancient and heavy, like the grief of a civilization that had endured something too terrible to speak of. A sorrow so deep it felt like a wound carved into time itself, and the emotional weight brought silence so deep that even breathing felt loud, because suddenly the aliens understood something they were never meant to know. This ship was not built in pride, it was built in pain. Built for a war humanity never wanted, built as a final line between survival and extinction, and that realization made the galaxy's mockery feel cruel and foolish, because they hadn't laughed at weakness, they had laughed at sacrifice, at suffering, at a species that may have given everything to protect something they loved. And as this truth landed like a blade in every heart, the warship stopped glowing, falling back into stillness, but the emotional scar it left behind remained. And now the fleet no longer saw an ancient relic. They saw a grave, a tomb for secrets. Too dark to imagine, and inside that silence a new fear took root. The fear that this ship was only the beginning, the first sign of a past the galaxy was never meant to uncover. And as the commander stared at the dark hull with shaking breath, he felt a single horrifying thought rise inside him. If this ship is waking up, then humanity might be coming back, and the galaxy was not ready for them. The moment the warship's faint glow faded, an even heavier silence took over, a silence so deep it felt like the entire galaxy was holding its breath, and while the fleet tried to calm themselves, pretending everything was under control, every heart on every ship beat faster, trembling with the unspoken truth that something inside that ancient Terran giant had responded, not by accident, not by mistake, but like a slow awakening, and the emotional pressure grew thicker, like invisible hands closing around every throat, because no one could escape the feeling that they had crossed a line they were never meant to cross, and the commander, who once mocked humans as weak and pathetic, now felt his chest tighten with a strange mix of guilt and terror, wondering if their arrogance had just stirred something that had been sleeping peacefully for 1,000 years. And as the fleet sent probes, drones, beams, anything to understand the ship, every single attempt failed, their machines shutting down, their data corrupting, their feeds going black, until it felt like the warship was rejecting their touch, pushing them away like an old wound that did not want to be reopened. And while the admirals argued over what to do next, the youngest soldiers felt something deeper, an emotional pull coming from the ship. A quiet whisper in their minds, a whisper that didn't use words but carried a feeling, loss, loneliness, and rage. Like the ship itself remembered a tragedy too massive for any living being to handle. And some crew members began to cry without knowing why, clutching their chests as if their hearts were breaking from a pain that wasn't even theirs, and the medical teams couldn't explain it, calling it mass hysteria. But deep down everyone knew it wasn't hysteria, it was connection, because the Warship was not just metal, it was history, a living monument to something humans had endured, something that had scarred them so deeply they vanished from the galaxy afterward. And that thought broke whatever pride the fleet still held, because now they weren't looking at a human joke. They were looking at proof that humans had once fought a war the galaxy could not even imagine. And as fear built like a storm inside every ship, one of the scientists discovered something horrifying buried in the sensor logs, a tiny signal, repeated every few seconds, so faint it almost went unnoticed, a signal in an ancient Terran frequency, a signal that translated into a single phrase. Last survivor protocol active, and those words hit the fleet like a blade through the heart, because it meant this ship wasn't just sleeping, it was the final remnant of something catastrophic. Maybe the only thing that survived whatever destroyed humanity's past. And suddenly everyone realized that this warship might not be alone, that there could have been others, or worse, that something once existed powerful enough to wipe out everything except this monstrous vessel. And panic began to spread, as some officers begged to retreat, begged to leave the system before it was too late. But their engines wouldn't start. Their ships locked in place as if the warship itself had taken control of the entire field. And then the hull of the Terran vessel shivered, just slightly, like a sleeping giant twitching in a nightmare, and a wave of raw emotion crashed over the fleet. Fear, anger, grief, all tangled together, making every being feel like they were drowning inside someone else's memories, someone else's pain. And in that moment the commander understood a horrifying truth, that this ship was not built out of ambition or conquest, but out of desperation, like the last scream of a dying civilization. A weapon forged not to conquer the galaxy but to survive it. And as tears filled his eyes, he whispered the words no one in the galaxy had ever dared to say. Maybe humans didn't disappear because they were weak. Maybe they disappeared because they saw something coming that no one else could stop. And as he stared at the dark, ancient hull, trembling from head to toe, he felt the crushing realization that the warship wasn't waking up to fight them. It was waking up because it remembered what destroyed everything before, and whatever that thing was, it might be coming back. The fleet drifted in silence, every ship frozen in fear, and the ancient Terran warship loomed like a dark mountain against the stars. And while no one dared to move or breathe too loudly, the Empire received a final encrypted file from their oldest archive. A file so ancient it had never been opened in living history, and when the commander accessed it, the screen flickered, the lights dimmed, and a trembling hush fell across the bridge as a forgotten recording began to play, not in alien language, but in old Terran speech, a voice heavy with exhaustion, grief, and a kind of pain that cut straight through the soul. And though no one understood the words, the emotion behind them hit every heart like fire, and the translation software worked slowly, painfully, revealing fragments that shattered everything they believed about humans. Because the recording was not a report, not a command, but a final message from a dying civilization. A message that spoke of a war so vast it consumed whole galaxies, of an enemy that came from beyond the known universe, a force that fed on worlds, that silenced suns, that drove humanity to the edge of extinction. And as the translation became clearer, the emotional weight grew heavier, showing glimpses of burning planets, shattered fleets, and human screams echoing through collapsing space. And every alien who watched felt their hearts crack with a sorrow that wasn't theirs. A sorrow so deep it felt like drowning in someone else's nightmare. Because humanity had not built the warship to conquer anything. They had built it because they had nothing left, because they were hunted, broken, desperate, and alone. And when the final lines appeared on the screen, the room shook as if the universe itself reacted, the message saying that this vessel was humanity's last shield, the final barrier against a darkness that could not be stopped, and that if the ship ever reawakened, it meant the enemy might return. And suddenly the fleet understood the horrifying truth that made their blood run cold, that humans had not disappeared. They had fallen, they had burned. They had sacrificed everything to stop something the galaxy had never even known existed. And as tears streamed down the face of the young officer who had once laughed at humans, she whispered that the warship wasn't a monument. It was a tombstone, a grave holding the last breath of a species that fought until they could fight no more. And the emotions swirling inside the fleet shifted from fear to guilt, because their mockery now felt cruel, heartless, like laughing at the scars of someone who died trying to save everyone. And the commander felt a sharp ache in his chest as he realized. The warship wasn't dangerous because of its weapons, it was dangerous because it carried the memory of a civilization that refused to surrender, and that kind of will was more terrifying than any gun. And just when the fleet thought they had seen the worst of the truth, the recording flickered one last time, showing a final timestamp, a date that made every being freeze in horror, because the war that destroyed humanity didn't happen thousands of years ago. It happened exactly 1,000 years after the ship was built, which meant humanity was destroyed only moments before the galaxy lost all contact with them. And that meant whatever had wiped them out was not ancient history. It was recent, it was real, and it might still be out there somewhere in the dark, waiting, searching, hungry, and the realization stabbed through every heart like ice. Because if the warship was humanity's final shield, and if it was waking up now, it could only mean one thing, the thing that destroyed. Humanity might be coming for the galaxy next, and as the warship's hull trembled again, as faint echoes like distant screams rumbled from deep within its core, every ship in the fleet felt the same crushing emotional truth. This was not a discovery, it was a warning, and the galaxy was already too late. The moment that realization settled like ice in every heart, the universe itself seemed to shrink, the stars suddenly feeling smaller, colder, farther away, and the fleet, once proud, once loud, once arrogant, now hovered in terrified stillness around the ancient Terran warship, and no one dared to speak above a whisper because it felt like any sound, any movement, any breath might wake something they were not prepared to face. And while panic rippled through the crews like a silent storm, a new signal burst from the warship, not loud, not violent, but slow and steady like the steady pulse of a heart returning from death. And lights flickered across its surface, thin glowing lines, tracing ancient Terran symbols that no alien had ever seen before, and with each pulse the air inside the Empire ships grew heavier, pressing down on lungs, squeezing throats, making even the strongest soldiers feel like children in the presence of something impossibly old and unbearably powerful. And the emotional weight became so overwhelming that many crew members collapsed to their knees, shaking, sobbing, gripping their chests as if invisible hands were pulling their hearts apart. Because the warship wasn't just activating systems, it was awakening memories, memories carved into its metal bones, memories of fire, loss, sacrifice, and a pain too vast for any living mind to hold. And images flashed into the minds of the fleet, not through screens, not through data, but directly into their thoughts, visions of destroyed human cities, families running, skies burning red, children crying as worlds collapsed behind them, fleets of human ships torn apart like paper by something unseen, something enormous, something alive, and the emotional impact was so raw, so brutal, that even the most hardened commanders felt tears spill down their faces, not from fear alone, but from grief, grief they did not understand but could not escape, as if the warship itself was sharing the last memories of a dying humanity, forcing the galaxy to feel what they felt in their final days. And then, without warning, the warship emitted a beacon into deep space, a long, low hum that shook every vessel. In the fleet, rattling steel, vibrating bones, making hearts skip as if the whole galaxy were being called to witness something. And terror spread as the navigators reported that the beacon wasn't random. It was a signal, a message, a location broadcast aimed at coordinates far beyond Empire borders, coordinates leading into dead space where no stars shone, where no ships traveled, where no life was known to exist, and the commander felt his blood turn cold as he whispered the truth shaking inside him, that the warship was calling someone, or something, and the thought alone made every being in the fleet tremble because they did not know whether it was calling for help, or calling back the enemy that destroyed humanity. And just when fear reached its breaking point, space itself tore open behind the warship, a silent ripple like a wound opening in the fabric of reality. And through that wound emerged a fleet unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, dark, massive, sleek, and shaped with designs that mirrored the ancient Terran vessel, but newer, stronger, alive with power that radiated like the heartbeat of a star. And when the first ship drifted forward, its hull illuminated with glowing symbols, a deep voice echoed across the void, calm, cold, unmistakably human, saying 3 words that shattered every belief, every assumption, every lie the galaxy had ever told about humanity. We are returning. And in that moment every soul in the fleet felt a wave of emotions crash into them. Fear because humanity was not extinct. Relief because they were not alone in the dark. Guilt because they had laughed at a species that had suffered more than anyone. And all because the humans who returned were not weak, not broken, not lost, but something evolved, something changed, something forged in 1,000 years of silence and pain. and as their fleet drifted closer, silent and watching, the ancient warship spoke for the first time in a voice that was not metal but memory, a voice trembling with anger and sorrow. "Do not fear US, fear what we fought." And those words pierced every heart like a blade, because suddenly the galaxy understood the horrifying truth. Humanity had not returned to conquer. They had returned because the darkness that once devoured their worlds might be coming back. And this time the galaxy would not be laughing. This time the galaxy would be praying for humans to stand between them and the end of everything. The warship's words lingered in the void like a cold breath against the soul, and the fleet, shaking, broken, silent, could only stare as the newly arrived human ships drifted closer, their hulls pulsing with an eerie living light, and every being watching felt a crushing weight settle in their chest. Because these were not the humans the galaxy remembered from old jokes and dusty textbooks. These were something different, something forged in 1,000 years of grief and darkness. And as the lead human vessel positioned itself beside the ancient warship, an overwhelming emotional pressure rippled outward. Not violent but unbearably heavy, as if their presence alone carried the sorrow of a civilization that had died once and learned how to breathe again. And the aliens inside the Empire fleet felt their bodies tremble uncontrollably. Their minds filled with a sense of smallness so deep it hurt. Because in that moment they understood that they were standing before a species that had lost everything and still returned standing. And the commander found himself gripping the edge of his console just to stay upright, tears burning in his eyes. Without knowing why, as if the human's very existence was a reminder of something ancient and heartbreaking, and then the communication channels crackled to life, but instead of words, a wave of pure emotion flooded through. Rage so old it felt fossilized, sorrow so endless it felt like falling into a void, and beneath it all a quiet, steady strength. The strength of beings who had refused to die even when the universe tried to erase them. And the youngest officer screamed, clutching her head, because she could feel thousands of voices layered together, whispering memories of burning skies, collapsing cities, and hands reaching for loved ones who would never return. And the medics tried to calm her, but they were crying too, their hearts splintering under the weight of a grief they had never lived but could somehow feel as if it were carved into their own bones. And just as the emotional storm seemed ready to tear every mind apart, it stopped, falling into stillness sharper than a blade, and a single human voice finally spoke through the channel, calm but trembling with unimaginable pain, saying that humanity had once begged the galaxy for help, pleaded for unity, begged for allies when the darkness first appeared, but no one had listened, no one had believed, no one had cared, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Because the fleet felt the accusation even without words. While humanity burned, the galaxy laughed, and the commander collapsed into his chair, chest shaking, because he realized the mocking, the jokes, the arrogance, all of it had been thrown at a species that had stood alone against a nightmare to protect a universe that never thanked them. And guilt spread like poison through every ship, making even the proudest admirals bow their heads in shame. And then the voice continued, softer now, heartbreak woven into every syllable, saying that humanity did not return for revenge, did not return for conquest, but because the darkness they once faced was stirring again, and the ancient warship had awakened as a final warning, not as a weapon but as a scar reopening, and the fleet shuddered as the warship emitted another pulse, this time slower, deeper, like the exhausted sigh of a titan carrying memories too heavy to bear. And the human voice whispered that they did not want war, they did not want blood. They wanted time, time to prepare, time to build, time to survive. Because the thing that destroyed their worlds was not just coming. It was already here, watching, waiting, hungry, and the fear that followed twisted every heart into knots. But beneath that fear was something else, something unexpected, a fragile thread of hope. Because if humanity had survived the impossible once, maybe, just maybe, they could stand against it again. And in that fragile moment the fleet understood the most emotional truth of all, that the humans who returned were not monsters or conquerors or ghosts. They were survivors, scarred beyond measure, broken and rebuilt, carrying the weight of 1,000 years of suffering, and yet still willing to stand between the galaxy and annihilation. And as the warship's lights flickered like a heartbeat returning to life, every soul in the fleet knew that the era of mockery was over, and the era of praying for humanity had just begun. The realization settled over the fleet like a storm cloud that would never clear, and the aliens, once full of pride and loud certainty, now felt as small as dust drifting in the shadow of giants. and as the human fleet floated silently beside the ancient warship, something shifted in the darkness, not a sound, not a movement, but a feeling. An overwhelming awareness that humanity was no longer merely a memory or a myth, but a force that had endured the unendurable, a force that had crawled out of extinction with wounds deeper than time. And the commander felt his throat tighten as he stared at the sleek Terran vessels, noticing how none of their hulls bore symbols of victory or conquest, but instead carried markings that looked like scars, long black lines carved into metal like gravestones, reminders of battles fought in silence, and grief so vast it changed the shape of their very ships. And he realized with a painful twist in his chest that humanity did not wear power like a crown. They wore it like a burden, something they never asked for but could never put down. And when the communication channel opened again, every being held their breath, expecting commands, threats, demands, but instead the human voice spoke softly, trembling with exhaustion and sorrow, saying that the humans aboard the returning fleet were not the same humans the galaxy once knew, that their bodies had changed, their minds had changed, their very souls reshaped by centuries of war and loss. And as the voice continued, images flashed across the minds of the fleet once more, not of destruction this time, but of humanity's final moments before their fall. Families huddled together as the skies turned black, soldiers holding the line while knowing they would never see home again, hands reaching out to each other through fire and death, whispering words of love as their worlds burned. And the emotional weight was so intense that even the hardened soldiers of the Empire bowed their heads, tears slipping down their faces because they finally understood that humanity had died not as a failed species but as a shield that shattered to protect a galaxy too blind to see the danger. And the youngest officer whispered through trembling lips that the humans had been heroes, not jokes, and her words broke something inside the fleet, a wall of arrogance collapsing into dust, leaving behind only shame and a desperate ache for forgiveness. And just when the silence became unbearable, the human voice spoke again, quieter now, almost fragile, saying that the returning fleet was not an army. They were the remnants of a civilization that had learned to survive in the dark, carrying the memories of billions and the weight of every loss. And they did not expect gratitude, they did not expect trust, they only hoped the galaxy would listen this time, because the darkness that once consumed them had not died, it had only retreated, waiting, evolving. And now its shadow stretched once more across the stars, and the warship pulsed with a slow, mournful light, as if echoing the truth of those words, its glow trembling like a heartbeat trying to begin again. And the commander felt his entire being shake with a single, overwhelming emotion. Not fear of humanity, but fear of what could break a species like them. What kind of monster could drive a civilization to its knees and leave behind only ships filled with ghosts and sorrow? And the fleet realized the most painful truth of all, that humanity's silence had never been abandonment, it had been a warning, a sacrifice, a plea, and the galaxy had laughed, turned away, refused to listen, and now the consequences stood before them in metal and grief. And as the returning humans drifted closer, their ships aligning with the ancient warship like family reuniting at a grave, the human voice whispered one final line that tore through every heart like a blade. We did not survive for vengeance. We survived so no one else would die alone. And those words unraveled whatever strength remained in the fleet, leaving every soul trembling, breathless, humbled, because in that single sentence lay a truth more emotional than anything they had ever known, that humanity, broken and bleeding, had returned not as conquerors, but as guardians forged in suffering, ready to stand once more between the universe and death, even if it cost them everything all over again. The words echoed through the void, sinking into every heart like a final breath, and for a long moment, the galaxy stood suspended in a silence so deep it felt like time itself refused to move, and the fleet, trembling and broken, stared at the returning humans with a mix of awe, grief, and a quiet, desperate hope they were almost afraid to feel, because these beings, these survivors forged in darkness, were no longer the fragile creatures the galaxy once mocked. They were the remnants of a love so powerful it chose to rise again even after death. And as the ancient warship pulsed with that slow, haunting heartbeat, the human fleet responded, their lights flickering in perfect rhythm, like 1,000 souls breathing as one. And something about that sight tore through the commander's chest, making his vision blur with tears, because it didn't look like an army preparing for war. It looked like a family mourning together, reunited at the grave of everything they once were. and the emotional weight became so heavy that many in the fleet collapsed to their knees, unable to stand beneath the realization that humanity had not just endured suffering. They had carried it, lived with it, grown from it, and returned bearing scars deeper than stars, and the communication channel opened once more. But this time there were no voices, only the soft sound of wind, a sound impossible in space, yet somehow echoing through every ship like the memory of a dying world exhaling for the last time. And images began to seep into their minds again, not of fire or destruction, but of earth, blue and quiet, oceans shimmering, cities filled with laughter, children running through sunlit fields, a world full of life and joy before the darkness came. And the sight shattered what remained of the fleet's strength, because they realized they had never truly understood what humanity lost, not just worlds or fleets, but love, home, innocence, and the image faded into darkness, replaced by a quiet whisper that felt like it came from millions of voices layered together. We remember, and that whisper sent chills through every soul, because remembrance was not a cry of pain, but a vow, a promise that humanity carried its past not as a chain, but as fuel, a reason to keep standing. And as the ancient warship groaned, metal shifting like bones waking from a 1,000-year sleep, enormous doors along its sides slowly opened, revealing vast chambers filled with dormant machines, rows upon rows of silent constructs shaped like armor and weapons. But none of them aimed outward, all pointed inward, as if guarding something sacred, and a bright glow rose from deep within the warship, a soft golden light that radiated warmth instead of fear, washing over the fleet like the comforting embrace of a long-lost memory. And for the first time since the nightmare began, the aliens felt something other than terror. They felt safety, not from their own strength, but from the strength of the species they once mocked. And as the light spread, activating long-dormant systems, the ancient warship spoke, again in a voice so gentle it broke every heart. We kept our promise, and no one knew what that promise was. But they could feel its weight, its love, like a vow made to protect something precious. And suddenly a new signal surged from the warship into the void, reaching farther than any technology had ever reached, cutting through galaxies, crossing the darkness like a torch lighting the path through night. And the returning human fleet turned toward that distant darkness, their ships shifting into formation, not aggressive, but resolute, like soldiers stepping forward to shield the weak. And the commander felt his breath catch as he understood what was happening. Humanity was not calling for allies. They were positioning themselves between the galaxy and whatever horror lurked in the unseen black, ready to face the nightmare again, even if it destroyed them a second time. And that realization twisted every heart into a painful knot, because this species, broken and grieving, was choosing to bleed for a universe that once left them to die, choosing to stand again for strangers who laughed at their suffering, choosing to love a galaxy that had never loved them back. And the youngest officer whispered through shaking lips that humanity was not dangerous because of their weapons, but because of their hearts, hearts that refused to abandon anyone, hearts that refused to surrender even when shattered. And in that moment the ancient warship's final message appeared across every screen, every visor, every mind in the fleet. A message carved in sorrow and steel. We do not seek war, but we will not run. And as the warship's engines rumbled for the first time in 1,000 years, as the Terran fleet turned toward the darkness spreading across the stars, every being watching felt their soul tremble with a truth that would echo through history. The galaxy was no longer laughing at humanity. The galaxy was praying for them, because if humans fell again, there would be nothing left to stand between the universe and extinction. And as the warship surged forward, its light blazing like a dying star roaring back to life, the fleet understood the final emotional truth. Humanity had returned not as conquerors, but as the last line between life and the end of everything, and the universe, breathless and terrified, could only watch as the guardians forged in pain disappeared into the dark, ready to face the nightmare no one else could.